Brothers and sisters, grace to you and peace from God our Father and from our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. When we talk about peace, we oftentimes, I think, talk about peace and define peace by a few common definitions. We talk about peace as being spiritual calm. Peace is that kind of thing that in terms of our relationship with us and God, we're at a place where everything is going okay and calm. Peace has to do with social calm. It has to do with the absence of conflict, the absence of war, those kinds of things. Peace is kind of a general hope that we offer in terms of we want peace for the world. But what does that mean? It can mean, well, all kinds of different things, but generally speaking, we want things to not be violent. We want to avoid conflict, those kinds of things. And peace can also be a social greeting, especially if you are a product of the 60s when that was used quite frequently as a way to wish someone well and so forth. What if peace is really something much deeper, something more rich, and something much, much more accessible? And that's the thing that we really want to get at today. Because the statistics about domestic violence in our country are quite sobering. There's an organization out there that says that the leading cause of injury to women is domestic violence. More so than car accidents, more so than robberies combined, domestic violence is the leading cause of injury to women in our country today. More than 3 women every day in our country are mortally wounded by those they supposedly loved and are loved by because of domestic violence in our country. And this last statistic to me is one of the most haunting. Victims of domestic violence lose nearly 8 million days a year of work. That's the equivalent of 32,000 full-time jobs. Because these saints can't go back to work because of the injury and the harm that's been visited upon them by those who supposedly love them. We flip a little bit here, and with those facts fresh in our minds, we go to our reading from the book of Isaiah for today. And as we pick up these words from Isaiah today, the world into which Isaiah is writing is a very tumultuous place. It's a world where God's people have split themselves not into one united country, but now they've been part of 2 kingdoms. The northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. There's been fighting between those 2, and the dangers of having countries outside of those 2 wanting to invade, wanting to cause them trouble, was ever apparent and ever with them. It was during this time that Isaiah writes that the country of Assyria, off the east of Israel and Judah, had become the world power, and they were very much interested in taking as much control and as much influence in the world at that time as they could. And they did so at the point of the spear. They did so by violence. And so you've got 2 kings at the time of Isaiah, King Sargon II, Sennacherib. Sennacherib is King Sargon II's son. And these 2 decide that they're going to expand Assyria and Assyria's influence. They're going to do it by any means necessary, which means if you don't want to go along with them, then suffer the consequences. And that's what they started to do. Assyria begins to expand its influence, and it does so by very violent, militaristic kinds of ways. And in fact, Sennacherib himself ends up implementing a very scorched-earth type of policy in terms of getting these countries that they want to take over to capitulate. You don't want to give up, we'll burn everything around you in order to get you to give up. And this is the world into which Isaiah is writing. This scorched earth policy is what God ends up using in order to bring judgment upon his people. God has been telling his people that their ways are errant, their ways are sinful, and he will judge them for them. And he ends up using Assyria as a way to judge his people and to go ahead and bring them to their knees. And so what ends up happening, of course, is that Assyria takes over both Israel to the north and ultimately creates a place where Judea can't continue to function. And it's this kind of scorched earth, it's this kind of militaristic takeover, this violent takeover. This is the kind of landscape into which our reading from Isaiah for today comes. And in the face of all that destruction, in the face of the reality of God's people saying, look, we're not much longer for the world in terms of how we're set up, in terms of how we're operating. Isaiah is called by God to bring the people a word of promise. And what does God compel Isaiah to say? Chapter 9 in our reading for today. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. Literally, that word in Hebrew that means darkness, literally in English means misery. And the phrase that Isaiah uses for deep darkness, that actually means death's shadow. So if we read it in literal English, the people walking in misery have seen a great light. On those living in the land of death's shadow, a light has dawned. It's a scary place out there at the time of Isaiah. It's a place where Assyria is coming to power, and it is gobbling up more and more, and there's not anything that God's people can do about it. They can stave off Assyria for a while, and they do. But after a while, Assyria asserts itself and says, no, we're done. And they begin to take over Israel as well as Judea, and yet in the midst of all of that, God comes to his people and says, the people walking in misery have seen a great light. On those living in the land of death's shadow, a light has dawned. And that light is none other than the promise of a child who will be born at some point in the future, not yet determined. A child who, like in the day of Midian's defeat, Midian, this country southwest of Israel, Judea, this country which had caused problems throughout Israel and Judea's history, this country which in Hebrew literally means strife. Like in the day of strife's defeat, what's going to happen is this child will come into the world, and he is going to shatter the yoke. He's going to shatter the bar. He's going to shatter the rod that creates oppression for God's people. He will come. Won't happen today, but he will come. And God makes that promise to his people. And he's going to be called Wonderful Counselor. And when he comes, he's going to be called Mighty God. And when he arrives, he's going to be called Everlasting Father. And when he arrives, he will be the Prince of Peace. He will be the Prince of Shalom. And what is God saying there through Isaiah? By peace, what God is saying in terms of all that this one is going to bring into the world, that word peace in Hebrew has a truckload of different meanings. And what God is packing into that promise about this one who will come into the world is that he is going to bring about completeness. He's going to bring about soundness. He's going to bring about the people's welfare, their health, their prosperity. He's going to bring quiet into their world. He's going to bring contentment, and he's going to bring them safety specifically in their bodies, which they don't have at that time. God promises that through this one that he's going to send into the world, he is going to give to his people this whole truckload of this thing, and of the greatness of that one's government and his peace, there will be no end. There is the promise, my friend. And that, of course, is a promise that was given to God's people 700 years before it happened. And yet God held out that promise to his people and said, the problems that you are going through now, the punishment that you're enduring now, I will bring about something different in the years to come. And this is the one upon whose shoulders all of this stuff will be delivered. And when he comes, there will be no end to the peace that he brings. And so as we talk about our series for this season of Advent, Light Now, light that is Jesus Christ, how is that working now in our world as we speak? What does the light that Isaiah promised, what does the light that God told Isaiah to promise to his people would happen, and it did? How does that light that Isaiah talks about today get worked out in our world right now? Here in St. Paul, there's an organization called Women's Advocates. And what they do is they provide an emergency residence in St. Paul. They also provide support services to 50 women and their kids every single day. This is an organization that's been around for a couple of decades now. And as they've been kind of figuring out how to best do these things, what they've done is they've established this residence, and they've got all these services for these women and these kids who are suffering from domestic violence. And what Women's Advocates is really doing in St. Paul, in our world these days, is the exact same thing that God promised he would end up doing, and the exact same thing that God delivered upon in terms of bringing Jesus Christ into the world. What Women's Advocates is doing for 50 women and their children every single day in our neighborhood is doing the exact same stuff, bringing completeness, soundness, welfare, health, prosperity, a place of quiet, a place of contentment, a place of safety, literally embodied for these women and these kids who are afraid, who have people in their lives who supposedly are loving them, but who are doing, in fact, the exact opposite. And this is how God is working in our own neighborhood. This is how God, in our own day and age, is bringing the same promise that he brought through Christ and is now living it out in our time and space. This is what God is doing. And so today, as we talked about last Sunday, during these Sundays in Advent, we're not only going to talk about these promises that God made real in Jesus Christ, we're not only going to spend these Sundays in Advent and talk about the kinds of things that God accomplished through Jesus Christ, we're going to do them in this space as well. As part of our worship, we're going to continue to invite you, as we did last week. We will end our worship with a benediction here in just a few minutes. If you need to go, God bless you. But if you wish to stay for a few more minutes before you go have coffee, before you go to Sunday school, before you go to adult Bible study, we are going to do something material in this space before we walk out to be the hands and feet of God working through Jesus Christ in the exact same way that he did a couple thousand years ago. And so what we're going to do is, with the help of Randy and Rebecca, who've pulled this together for this week, and they'll be telling us exactly what we're doing, we're going to assemble welcome packs that will go to Women's Advocates. And as these ladies and as their kids come to stay, come to find peace and security and wholeness at this place, these are the kinds of things that will be there to help them out. As you may imagine, when women make the decision finally to get out of that cycle of violence, it's not something that happens with a lot of forethought and with a lot of planning. Sometimes it happens very, very quickly, and these women and their kids have nothing with them when they arrive. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to pack up some things, some items, some toiletries, some comfort items, which will be there to greet them when they get there. Because of the never-ending nature of Jesus' greatness of his government and his peace, may our efforts to reflect his light, may our efforts here this morning to continue this story of what God has done through Isaiah, through Jesus, and into our present time, bring these saints that will receive these gifts the same kind of true, lasting, real peace that God promises to his people every season. The Lord be with you.